Great. Well, welcome everybody to BMSCLive. We're really excited to be hosting this session today as a part of Ocean Week Canada. The Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, where I am located, and the beach where our field team are located are all within the traditional territory of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation, and we're really excited and grateful to be broadcasting to you live from Huu-ay-aht territory. The Huu-ay-aht First Nation are one of the Channel Nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and they're also one of the nations that signed the Manoth Treaty, which was the first modern-day treaty on Vancouver Island. So very grateful to be on that territory and broadcasting to you live, both from the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center and from Brady's Beach. My name is Owen. I'm an educator here at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, and in a moment, I will introduce you to our team out in the field. I can't do this alone. We got a whole team of folks out in the field ready to show you some really cool things on the beach. A little bit about the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center as we get started here, in case you don't know. We are a branched campus of the 5 large universities in Western Canada. So that's University of British Columbia, University of Calgary, University of Alberta, Simon Fraser University, and University of Victoria. And we've been accepting researchers and students here at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center for 50 years. We're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this summer, which is really exciting. Also want to shout out to NSERC PromoScience, who provide us funding to run some of our education programs, including BMSCLive, our virtual field trips. So thank you to NSERC PromoScience. As I said before, in case there's a few new people tuning in, you can interact with us through the chat function of Zoom. So you can ask us questions via that chat function, and we might ask you some questions as well. So feel free to use that chat to save us bandwidth. We don't have video and audio from the participants. So that's your way to communicate with us. So before I send you out to our field team, I want to show you a little bit about where we are. So you guys have all been letting us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. I'm going to show you where Bamfield is, just in case you don't know. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go on a little tour using Google Earth. All right, here we go. So we see before us North America. As we zoom in a little bit here on British Columbia, you can actually see a little pin drop where the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center is. So we're moving in on the lower mainland here in Vancouver Island. You know, see kind of all of Vancouver Island and Vancouver over here on the mainland. So if you were coming to visit us here at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, you might get here perhaps originally from Vancouver. We have lots of students and school groups that come from Vancouver. From Vancouver, you would take a ferry across to Nanaimo on the east coast of Vancouver Island. Then you might drive all the way up here to Port Alberni. Once you make it to Port Alberni, there are kind of 2 ways to get to the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center. You could drive a logging road all the way down here, or you could take a boat. There's a ferry that runs from Port Alberni 3 times a week down Alberni Inlet, out into Barclays Sound, which is this big body of water here, and then to Bamfield. So here on the west coast of Vancouver Island, up here is Ucluelet. Many people have been to Ucluelet before. This body of water is called Barclays Sound, and within Barclays Sound, there are lots of islands. This group of islands over here are the Broken Group of Islands. They're part of Pacific Rim National Park and are a really famous kayaking destination. Bamfield is down here, just south of the Deer Group of Islands, so this other chain of islands. As we zoom in closer, you can actually see the town of Bamfield. So here's the town of Bamfield, separated by Bamfield Inlet, this little stretch of water here. It's one of the really neat things about Bamfield is that the town is split in half on 2 sides of this inlet. So over here on the east side is the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center. This is our campus right here. And the field team that are going out to the beach today, they got there by crossing over the inlet to the west side of town, and then they walked all the way down here to where it says Brady's Beach. So just to kind of complete the picture of where Brady's Beach is over on the west side of Bamfield, I have another little video that I'm going to show you. This is a fun little time lapse that we filmed to show you how our field team would be getting to Brady's Beach. So if you just bear with me for a second. Okay, so from the main building of the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, here we go. You go down the hill. This is a trip that you would actually go on if you came to the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center as a university student or as a high school student as one of our field trips. We would take all of our groups to Brady's, cross over the inlet here. Now we're on the west side, tie up the boat, start walking to Brady's. It's about a 1 kilometer walk down dirt roads on the west side of Bamfield. You see that there are vehicles on West Bamfield, but there's no road access to that side. So all those vehicles in West Bamfield have to be taken over by barge. And it's a beautiful day today in Bamfield. When we shot this video, it was also a beautiful day. Sun is shining, weather's getting a little bit warmer. Come down this last hill and come out onto the world famous Brady's Beach. Here it is. And now our team walked all the way down past the sea stacks to the rocky intertidal zone down at the south end of Brady's Beach. All right.
Hi, everyone.
So now we're going to send things over to our field team, and off to you, Kelly.
Awesome. Thank you, Owen. We are here on Brady's Beach. My name is Kelly, and I have one other team member helping me out today behind the camera. So let me just do a quick introduction for you to Jen. And you will notice that Jen is wearing a funny little contraption on her back. This is our cell booster setup that allows us to go into the field and broadcast these live labs to you. So there's Jen, and that's how we're delivering this all the way across Canada. I know most of the viewers that I was seeing tuning in are from different parts of BC, but there are a few hopefully joining from other parts of Canada as well. So welcome to beautiful, picturesque Brady's Beach. It's such a gorgeous spot here, well worth the walk that we took to arrive at this location. And you definitely don't have to be a marine biologist to learn to appreciate or just to appreciate a place like this. Let's take a moment to just kind of pan around at the beach and the settings, the environment here of Brady's Beach. There are even a few other maybe tourists that have come to visit, although even locals of Bamfield make a point of coming to visit Brady's Beach on a regular basis because it's such a lovely spot. And so part of what makes it so special is we have a mixture of sandy sections. You can see some sand over there in the distance. And there's also these rocky sections of the beach as well. And right now we have timed our live lab perfectly to coincide with low tide. And for those of you who have been to the beach before and visited the seashore at a low tide, it's always really fun to visit when the tide is out, when the water has receded a little bit, because it uncovers this whole section of the intertidal zone. It's called the intertidal zone because at high tide, the water would be up almost to where I'm standing on these rocks here. The water would come right up to about here. And now that it's low tide, the water has receded a couple of meters below high tide. And this whole section of beach is now exposed, known as the intertidal zone. There's lots of great marine life that lives within the intertidal zone. Both animals, seaweeds will be showing off some of these wonderful creatures of the intertidal zone so that you get to meet them, which will be a lot of fun. As we get started looking around, I'll remind you, you can ask me questions in the chat. Just type in your questions. They'll pop up on the screen and either Jen will read them to me or Owen will answer some of them for you. And we'll do our best to answer them live as we go along. I want to take a look back at our sea stacks for a second, because they're sort of an interesting rock formation. So let's take a look at these sea stacks. And I have a question for you, our audience. How did these sea stacks form? That's what these funny rock formations are called, these big pillars of stone. They happen to have some trees growing on top, and there are even some smaller ones closest to us. I'm even standing on one right here, which I like to call it a sea stump. It's kind of a short little sea stack. How did those rock formations form? Where did they come from? And this one might give you some thoughts. Ooh, I like the word weathering. That's a good one. So some answers are coming in here. Weathering, maybe erosion is a good word to use to describe this. And those are true. So once upon a time, our shoreline actually extended much further west. Just beyond the sea stacks there is the direction west. And once upon a time, this would have been a big rocky headland in this area. But over time, a long time, we're talking, the ocean waves actually crashed against the rocks and wore them down in certain ways. So the rocks wore away, leaving behind only certain types of rock. And that's where those sea stacks actually come from. Now, the rock that got worn down got worn into tiny, tiny little particles, and that's where all the sandy sections of Brady's Beach come from. So it's this really interesting geology happening with sea stacks, sand, and then in the intertidal zone, we have another great rock formation that is really worth checking out whenever you visit a seashore. And that doesn't matter which coast of Canada or probably the world that you're visiting. When you get the experience of visiting a tide pool, there's so much exciting life in a tide pool. So we're going to show you some tide pools right here. There's a few here on the beach, and maybe I'll just turn things over to Owen for a moment to share a video just showing some of the colors that are possible within a tide pool. So I'll turn things over to Owen for a second, and we'll get ourselves in position so that you can see your first tide pool here on Brady's Beach.
Great, thank you very much, Kelly. I'm gonna share another little video here for you. This is one of my favorite little clips of a tide pool. Our camera that's on the beach today doesn't actually stream live from underwater. So we have some pre-recorded video clips here to show you what it looks like inside these tide pools. So this is very exciting. Not a lot of people get an opportunity to go swimming down in a tide pool. Most of them are quite small. So as we get into this tide pool here, it just kind of showcases how beautiful the colors are. So some of that pink on the back there, the darker pink, is a calcified algae. It's actually a crust-forming algae with calcium in its structure. There's also some lavender sea sponge on the sides of this tide pool, some bright green anemones. We'll talk lots more about anemones soon. I see some snails down at the bottom, some green algae as well. Brown algae, white barnacles, lots and lots of colors there. That yellow thing that you saw at the beginning, actually a species of nudibranch. So nudibranchs are sea slugs. They're not that common in the intertidal, but sometimes we do see them in tide pools if we're really lucky. These beautiful little nudibranchs or sea slugs. Okay,
awesome.
Kelly.
Thanks, Owen. And so here I am standing around your first glimpse of an actual tide pool here on the beach. And this is just a really exciting feature of the geology of this beach, that as the water has receded at low tide, it left behind this little pool. And it's just a depression in the rock, just a shallow spot that has collected all the water. And now so many different types of marine life are living just in this one, maybe square meter of tide pool, smaller than a square meter even. So I don't know how well you can see it on camera. On one side of this tide pool, it looks really black and dark colored. These are mussels on one side. A number of little anemones, and we'll show you these animals in more detail here in a second, because what we did is we brought a GoPro camera to the tide pool, and we were able to collect some underwater footage, just like the video that you just saw. We have footage of all of these tide pools here on Brady's Beach to show you all of the diversity of marine life, whether it's anemones, mussels. There's some fish in this tank, or in this tide pool, that we'll talk about some more, and then all kinds of other stuff that's hiding in amongst these animals and these creatures. So it's a pretty exciting place, and our goal today is to just do some exploration. We'll see what we can find. We'll show off the different species that are common here on Brady's Beach, and hopefully you guys enjoy the show and getting to meet these creatures. So let's start off talking a little bit more about anemones, because there's quite a lot of them in this tide pool. I don't know how well you can see right along the edge over here. Many of them are closed up right now. There's also some right along the edges, even in the shallow parts of the water. And they don't look like anemones right now because they're closed up. That is pretty normal at low tide. these anemones do live in kind of a harsh environment. It is actually a bit warm in Bamfield today, which doesn't usually happen. It hasn't been very warm most of, I don't know if we can even call it summer this year. Hasn't been very summery in Bamfield lately until today. But you can imagine with just a small pool of water like this, it starts to heat up pretty quickly in the sunshine. And so these animals need to be able to tolerate pretty big changes in the temperature when the ocean is when the tide is up and the ocean is constantly flushing this tide pool. The water is pretty cold, but now on the beach it's just sitting here, it's warming up in the sun, and these animals need to be able to handle that pretty big temperature change. So anemones and mussels and barnacles and even these fish in here are pretty hardy, I guess we could say. So maybe Owen, you can share a video to show people a little bit closer up what kind of anemones these are. Let's take a look at these
I would
little
love
green
to.
anemones.
So here we go. Here's another video clip getting down inside this tide pool. You'll notice once we get underwater, lots of big California mussels, which are a mollusk, kind of like a clam. And as we pan over this way, we see lots of these little anemones. So you'll notice how some of them are kind of closed up. You can't really see their tentacles. Others, the tentacles are out in the water. So anemones use those tentacles to catch prey. Most of these smaller anemones, they're actually catching pretty small prey, plankton that are floating around in the tide pool or that are brought in when the tide comes in. In fact, these mussels are also filter feeders, but rather than having tentacles, they suck water into their internal structure, then they filter out those same bits of food, plankton, from that seawater inside their shells. So that type was kind of neat because you have all on one side, you have a whole bunch of sea anemones, and on the other side, you got all of those mussels.
And we just switched positions here so that maybe you can see these anemones a little bit better. There's almost a whole wall of them right along this edge of the tide pool. They're very closely clustered together. Most of them are closed up. Now, something really interesting about anemones is that when they reproduce, they have the ability to just divide themselves and make copies of themselves. So every once in a while, you'll find one. There's maybe even a few of them here, although I don't know how well you can see them. You'll find them where they're just kind of, instead of a round animal like this, they get stretched out long, more oval shaped, so that what's happening is they're in the process of dividing their bodies, and eventually that oval will split off and become two separate anemones. But if you were to test their genetics, you would find that both of those two anemones are actually the same. They have the exact same genetic information, but it's two separate individuals. So maybe all of these anemones in this pool, how they're clustered so tightly together, they might actually have started from just one anemone that just divided and divided and divided a whole bunch of times and spread out. And eventually they've settled on all the available rocky real estate within this pool. So you can't really even see the rocks beneath anymore. It's all covered up with anemones. Let's take a look at another video, or actually there's a question. Someone is asking whether the California mussels are native or considered to be invasive. Are California mussels native or invasive? That's a great question. Because they're called California mussels, you'd think, oh, they're an invasive species. But that's just a species that has kind of expanded its range up the coast from California. They're still also found in California too. So they're not actually considered an invasive species, although they are established here. It's not an invasive species. But if we keep looking around, we might actually find an invasive species later today. So I'll point it out if I find it. But the mussels are not considered invasive. And these mussels are edible too. Okay, Owen, show us another video of the aggregating anemones.
Yeah, so just before I even start this video, I want you to notice the little pink tips of the tentacles here. That's a good feature for identifying this species. If you come to a beach and you find some little anemones with a green base like this and little pink tip tentacles, that's a pretty good chance that they're these aggregating anemones. Oh, and I see something swimming around in the background. We'll come back to that animal in a second. Got lots of aggregating anemones here. If they catch a prey, then those tentacles will stick onto those prey. and pull the prey kind of into the center there where there's a little mouth into a digestive cavity. So the mechanism by which they capture their prey is actually similar across all anemones, and it's actually the same mechanism in related organisms like jellyfish and even corals. In their tentacles for catching prey, they have tiny little harpoons which they fire into their prey, microscopic harpoons that can actually stun prey to incapacitate them so they can bring that prey into their digestive cavity in the middle there.
That's a really good point, Owen. For those of you who've maybe had the opportunity to visit a shoreline like this and see anemones in a tide pool or just on the rocks, maybe you've touched them with your fingers. It's really fun. I highly encourage you to do that if you get the chance. But what it feels like when you touch an anemone is sticky. The tentacles are almost sticking to your fingers, and as you try to pull your finger away, it's kind of stuck on there. And that's the same process that's happening. That anemone is literally trying to eat you by stinging you. Luckily, your hands are immune to the stunning sting of the anemone, so you're okay to do this. Probably hurts the anemone more, although I don't think it hurts them actually. It's their reaction that they automatically do whenever something touches their tentacles. They're looking for food. They're hoping that your finger is food when you do this. Great. So Owen was mentioning some movement of another animal in one of the videos that he just shared, and I can see the same kind of movement in this tide pool at my feet as well. But when we pan the camera down to look, I don't think you're going to notice anything out of place necessarily. It just looks mostly like anemones, mostly like mussels over here. But there are some creatures lurking in here that are great swimmers, and they're also really great camouflagers. There's one, I don't know if it'll hold still long enough, right here. I don't know if you can even see that because this animal is super good at camouflaging. It's right in a clump of seaweed, but I wouldn't be surprised if you can't even see it. Maybe that's because of the glare of the pool. But luckily, we do have some other footage of these creatures. They are a special kind of fish that a lot of people call them bullheads, but that's not actually their name. They're called sculpins instead. So let's take a look at some tide pool sculpins that are hiding in here.
Okay, tide pool sculpins, here we come. So as we get back underwater in this tide pool, you might be looking around, you don't really see any fish. You might be thinking, Kelly and Owen, what are you talking about? I don't see anything. But down at the bottom of your screen here, just came into view, is a little tide pool sculpin. The tide pool sculpin is a really common species of fish that we find in our tide pools here. They come in a variety of color patterns. Depending on the tide pool that they live in. Here's another one up here and then another one in the top right corner there. So those are a really common fish species found in our tide pools around here. I'm gonna pull up another another video here just to kind of show you how different they can be in their color pattern. So the ones that we just saw in that first video were green. In this next video clip, keep an eye out for the sculpin in this video clip. It's the same species. Maybe you've seen it already. Kind of in the middle of the top of your screen there is another tide pool sculpin. Oh, it just moved. So they become much more visible when they move around. This one is more white and brown, so it actually blends in much better with the specific tide pool that it's living in. And you might think, what if one sculpin moves from one tide pool to another? Wouldn't it not blend in then? True, but it was actually discovered that these tide pool sculpins have a home tide pool. So whenever the tide is out, they actually return to the same pool. And so they develop coloration that actually matches their home tide pool. And then when the tide comes back in, then they can swim around the beach underwater and forage for food. And then the tide goes back out again and they go back and they find their same tide pool. They blend in really well. So sometimes if you're walking along the beach, you walk past a tide pool and you'll see them. If you startle them, they'll kind of zip from one side of the tide pool to the other, zoom all around. Those are the tide pool sculpins. Okay,
And
back.
I noticed a lot of tide pool sculpins here. When I first walked over to this spot, there was a lot of zipping around going on in this tide pool. And now they've kind of found their hiding spots. And I can still see the odd one or two moving just a little bit, but they're mostly settled and hiding from me right now. But there's quite a few of them in here. So this is an abundant fish that if you go and visit the shoreline, you would probably find tide pool sculpins in lots of different tide pools around here, but you wouldn't really find too many other kinds of fish in tide pools. Most other fish live deeper underwater and they retreat whenever the tide starts to go out. They will also go and head back into deeper water. All right, let's head to another tide pool. Just behind us is a second one. It's a little bit deeper and it has a few different kinds of anemones in it, from these pink-tipped aggregating anemones in this pool. We're going to go take a look at some giant green anemones. So let's take a little walk here. We have to move pretty carefully along the shoreline because it's covered in barnacles and seaweed, so it's kind of slippery and the ground's really uneven. And also our camera gets shaky if we move too quickly. So we're just gonna slowly make our way over to this other tide pool just over here, and you guys can take a look at what's inside.
And Kelly, someone in the chat asked about wireweed as an invasive species. So I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. There is an invasive species of seaweed in our area called Japanese wireweed, usually more likely to be found in slightly more sheltered areas. So there's actually a lot of it in Bamfield Inlet at the moment. A little bit less likely to be found on exposed rocky shores like Brady's, but sometimes we do find little pieces of it growing in some of our tide pools. So maybe Kelly can keep an eye out for it. And if she sees it later on our beach adventure, can point out Japanese wireweed, which is an invasive seaweed species, which is actually out competing a lot of our local seaweed species for space.
Yeah, good point, Owen, and thank you for the audience member for asking that question. Luckily, I don't see any of that invasive seaweed in this particular pool or in the one that we were just looking in, but I will point it out to you if I see it. Now I'm looking all around trying to find if it's here. Hopefully it's not, though. That's the kind of thing that we don't want to find on our beach exploration today. But you will find some other different species in this tide pool from what we saw in our last one. So let's take a look deep down inside. This one's deeper. It's probably longer than the whole length of my arm. It would be tough for me to reach all the way to the bottom. Try not to disturb the water here so that you can see these creatures down at the bottom. So these are a new kind of anemone. The last pool we saw the aggregating anemones. These ones are much larger. They are deep underwater, but they're about the size of my hand underwater, whereas the aggregating ones were just about that size. So these are the giant green anemones down here. And there's also quite a large California mussel in here. So again, it's tricky to get the shot of this tide pool with, I know there's a lot of glare on the surface of the water. So we actually have some GoPro footage of this exact tide pool to show you instead. Maybe Owen can help with that.
Yeah, here we go. So here's some nice clear footage underwater in these tide pools. You will notice this species also green like the aggregating anemone, but the tentacles are a very different color. So they lack those pink tips. They're generally quite a bit larger. So in this footage, actually, I'm just going to pause it for a second. We get a nice clear shot looking down on the top of these surf anemones, or giant green anemones are two common names for them. We can see the opening into the little digestive cavity. Sea anemones, like their relatives, the jellyfish, only have one opening through which they eat food and excrete waste. So this is a multi-purpose mouth and anus. They don't have a digestive tract that goes all the way through their body. They eat food and then excrete the waste out the same hole. We just finished our little video clip here. See these nice big giant green anemones. Back to Kelly.
Cool. And something that I find really fascinating about anemones is that we don't actually know how old they get. Scientists are still puzzled by this because an anemone could probably live longer than most humans do. So we haven't just actually bothered to follow one all the way through its life because it would take multiple humans keeping an eye on the same anemone to actually figure out how old it can be. So we don't know the answer to that. Isn't that so cool? If you've ever had the opportunity to visit the whale lab at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, we have a touch tank that has some anemones inside, including the giant green anemones. But there are also what we call some fish-eating anemones, or fish-eating anemones is the most common name that we use for them. They've been in the touch tank for over 20 years, maybe even closer to 30 years, and they've sort of looked the same the entire time. So they're at least 30 years old, but they could be even older than that. And there's not really a good way of telling how old an anemone is. We don't have a good way to age them, but pretty neat. There's another video of some giant green anemones here at Brady's Beach. So I'll turn things back to Owen for a second.
Okay, one more video for you here. The thing that I want you to really pay attention to here in this video is the color of these giant green anemones. They are, as the name suggests, quite green. And so even comparing that to the green seaweed, also in this tide pool, the green color in both of these organisms, in both the seaweed and the anemone, comes from the same place. So maybe if you think back to when you might have learned about plant or algae biology, and maybe back in high school or in university was the most recent time, where is that green color coming from? Does anyone know where the green color comes from in plants and algae? If you have an answer for us, throw it in the chat. I'll pass things back over to Kelly, and she'll continue evolving our story here.
That's a great question, Owen. So yeah, we'll give our viewers a chance to think about that for a second. And if you've watched one of our Brady's Beach visits before, you maybe already know the answer, but it's still an interesting story to tell. So to take this story another step further, another interesting geological feature of Brady's Beach happens just down the beach behind me. There's actually a sea cave. And this is common along the west coast of Canada. Just like the waves eroded the shoreline to create the sea stacks, they also sometimes erode the rocks away to create caves. And so they're pretty common, littered all along the rocky shorelines of our area. The sea cave at Brady's you can actually go inside it when the tide is low enough. And today would have been an okay tide, except that we discovered that you also can't broadcast a live lesson from inside of a cave. The signal just doesn't go. So we had to pre-record the footage from the cave as well to show you the difference. And inside the cave, many of the same animals that we're seeing in our tide pools here are living in this cave. But of course, it's dark in there. So there's some differences. And we wanted to show you the colors of the anemones that live inside the cave and compare those to the ones that live here on the beach. So I'll turn things over to Owen for some pictures of those anemones.
So I see in the chat, a bunch of people are mentioning chlorophyll as the reason why plants and algae are green. And you're 100% correct. So chlorophyll is what gives the green color to plants and algae, these photosynthetic organisms. And you might remember that I said that the sea anemones get their color from the same place. So some sea anemones actually have chlorophyll in them as well. And so they use that chlorophyll also for photosynthesis. The sea anemones that are found inside the Brady Sea Cave don't have chlorophyll because there isn't enough light in there for them to photosynthesize. So when we take you over into the Brady's cave, I'll show you a video clip from inside that cave. Notice that the same species of sea anemone, the surf anemone or the giant green anemone, is no longer green. There's like a faint greenish tinge there, but they're mostly white. Wild. So maybe Kelly can talk just a little bit about why those sea anemones can actually photosynthesize. And while she's doing that, I'll share a few more videos of white sea anemones in the cave.
Yeah, absolutely. So out here, our anemones have lots of sunlight coming down on them, and they're able to use that sunlight to do photosynthesis, just like a plant would on land, and just like the seaweeds are doing on the beach around me too. And I'll talk about seaweeds in just a second, but they work very similarly to how plants do in that they capture sunlight. These anemones, by having these little algae cells inside of them, they can effectively do the same thing. So basically we're looking at a photosynthetic animal, which is super weird. Animals aren't supposed to be able to photosynthesize, but anemones can do it. The giant green anemones especially can do that. But inside the cave, there isn't enough light for photosynthesis to be happening, and therefore these anemones have to rely only on catching their food using their stinging tentacles, and they aren't able to photosynthesize. Is there a question? Would the anemones in the cave be smaller due to the lack of extra food? Perhaps, but as long as there's enough other ability for them to catch things with their tentacles, they probably will be just fine without it. And so Owen, I think, has another video to share, just showing a few more. Both the aggregating anemones and the giant green anemones will look the same way. You can tell them apart because the aggregating anemones still have those pink tips on their tentacles, despite being kind of a grayish color otherwise once they're inside the cave.
Yeah, in this video clip, you can actually see some green and white anemones right next to each other. I think this is closer to the opening of the cave. So there are still some anemones in this cave that have some photosynthetic phytoplankton living inside them, as well as some that haven't really retained those same phytoplankton as a symbiotic partner. So both the giant green anemone, we will in a moment here, I think, see an aggregating anemone. There we go. So you remember that the aggregating anemone also had the little pink tips to their tentacles. So this anemone here, you can see those little pink tip tentacles. The same species that we saw earlier in the tide pool that exists in the cave, even without its photosynthetic partner. It would be really interesting to actually do a survey and see if there was a noticeable size difference or in these anemones for the ones in the cave compared to out of the cave based on how much nutrients they're getting. Interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And Owen, you brought up a really great word too, the use of the word symbiosis. So that's an example of where two different species are living together and depending on one another for certain resources. In the case of the anemone, it's a mutual symbiosis. The algae cells that do the photosynthesizing have a place to live. They're safe within the cells of the anemone, of the animal, but the animal benefits by having the photosynthetic ability of the algae as part of its tissue, so it gets more food that way. So it works well for both of the species in that particular symbiosis. Not all symbioses are beneficial like that, but this particular one is.
Kelly, I want to jump in here just for a second.
Yeah.
Someone asked what the mollusk was in the foreground of that video clip. So if I actually just bring up the video clip again and show everyone what was being talked about. So here we again see that aggregating anemone, and right below it is a clump of organisms, which is not actually a mollusk. They kind of look a little bit like some mollusks. Mollusks would be things like snails or limpets, or clams or mussels, or even octopus and squid are all considered mollusks. The organism right below the sea anemone here is actually an arthropod. It's a kind of barnacle, so more closely related to crabs and insects than it is to things like clams. And this species of barnacle is kind of a weird one. They're not as commonly seen as things like acorn barnacles. If you're walking on a beach around Bamfield, all the little barnacles covering the rocks in the open areas outside of a cave, those are probably acorn barnacles. These gooseneck barnacles only live in areas with much higher wave exposure. They really like to be battered by the waves. So those are gooseneck barnacles. They actually have a muscular neck kind of below the hard shell plates at the top, which connects them to the rock. That muscular neck allows them to be a little bit flexible in the exposed wave areas. And actually that little muscular neck is an edible part. So maybe some of you have eaten gooseneck barnacles before. They're considered a delicacy. They taste kind of like other arthropods like crab or shrimp or lobster. Those are gooseneck barnacles.
Cool. And gooseneck barnacles are likely found on Brady's Beach out here outside of the cave as well. I would just have to go out to the far edges of the rocks to be able to find them because, like Owen says, they only live in really wave-swept areas, and I'm sort of sheltered on this particular piece of rock. I chose to stand here on purpose because I knew that a big wave wouldn't come crashing over me while we're in the middle of our lesson here. So but if I went out into the more dangerous parts closer to the water's edge and the waves crashing in, I might be able to find those gooseneck barnacles. For that reason, that's why I'm also wearing my trusty orange life jacket here. We always wear our life jackets on the beach for safety reasons because you never know when a rogue wave might come along. But Jen's helping me keep an eye on the ocean here so that that doesn't happen to us. All right, so since we were talking about photosynthesis of the anemones and their algae that lives inside of them, we can take a look at some seaweeds that also photosynthesize. And there's a really great pool of seaweeds just behind me. I'll get out of the way so you guys can have a look on the rocks down here. Swirling around in the water are a number of brown and green seaweeds mixing together. And the brown seaweeds have a really fun name. They're called feather boa. You can think of them like a piece of a boa from a costume and covered in feathers. These ones are covered in little leaves, little brown leaves. They are very abundant here. And then the green ones mixed in amongst that are called surf grass. And that actually is not a seaweed at all. It's a grass like you would have on land that has just evolved to learn to live in the ocean. So it can actually survive in salt water despite it being basically a flowering plant, which is kind of interesting. And then as I was walking over here, I found one of my most favorite seaweeds of all, which is the bull kelp. And let me show you the bull kelp. This was just washed up on the beach here. So it's not alive anymore, but this is a pretty good example of a bull kelp. Here we go. It was a little tangled up here. So it has at one end, it has sort of a round bulb and these leafy parts here, these are actually called blades, but the leafy parts are what do the photosynthesis. So normally these would be near the surface of the ocean. Up near the surface is where they get the most amount of sunlight, so that's ideal for photosynthesizing. And then this bulb is hollow inside. Think of it like a balloon, basically. So it's hollow, it's full of gases inside, and that helps the seaweed to float to the surface of the water, keeping those blades spread along the surface so that they can photosynthesize better. And then it has this great big long stalk, long stem. It's coiled around several times here that goes all the way down, and it's clustered at the bottom. I gotta remove some other bits of seaweed that got stuck to it. There's this really unusual shaped thing at the bottom. This is called a holdfast. And the holdfast is what anchors the seaweed to the rocks. And normally a holdfast does a pretty good job of anchoring the seaweed to the rocks. But in this case, we must have had a big enough storm that it wrenched it free. Normally this would be attached to a rock on the underside. So this part would have been attached to the rock here. There's even a little piece of a rock right here that broke off. The seaweed actually took the rock with it as it came loose, which is pretty wild. Must have been a big storm. And yes, even though it's supposed to be summertime, we've had some decent storms and big waves lately. This one's called bull kelp, and it's one of the two species that really commonly forms kelp forests along our coast. And there's kelp forest just off the rocks here at Brady's Beach. So it must have broken free from just over here and kind of washed in onto the beach. Great. Okay, well, we're starting to wind down our lesson. We have maybe about 10 minutes left, and we can look around for a few other creatures. There's a few more things that I'd love to be able to show you on the beach. So is there a question? Can you eat bull kelp? Yes, you can eat bull kelp. It is definitely edible. I'm not going to eat this particular one because it looks like it's starting to decay a little bit. Some of the leaves aren't looking as fresh, but you can eat the leaves for sure. Another way that I have actually eaten bull kelp myself is I can break this one maybe because it's already dead. Inside If you can see inside of it, it's hollow in the middle. I've actually seen people cut these into little, I don't know, medallions, I guess would be the word for it, little slices, and put it into brine and eat them just like pickles. So you could have like dill pickles, you can have dill bull kelp stipe as well. And it's actually pretty tasty as long as you like pickles. So that's another way that you could eat bull kelp. It is definitely edible. And most of the seaweeds around this shoreline are also edible, although you have to watch out. There's the odd one that produces some indigestible compounds, including calcium and silica, and one in particular that produces sulfuric acid. So you don't want to eat all of the kelps out there or the seaweeds out there, but most of them are safe. And there's lots of great ID books to help you figure out which one you're looking at if you're curious and you happen to be visiting one of the shorelines in our area. So let's take a look at some more areas of the beach. We'll go back the way we came, but maybe while we're maneuvering to a new spot, Owen can show a video of one of the more fearsome predators that is found on this beach. And when I say predators, maybe you're thinking like, ooh, cougars or bears or something. But in marine predators, there's one invertebrate, which is an animal that doesn't have a backbone, that is pretty common on our beaches here, often found in tide pools and near the water's edge, that is very hungry. So maybe Owen can bring up a video to show us these animals. They often have 5 arms.
Absolutely. So here we go. I'm going to show you a few different species. The organism that Kelly is talking about is the Voracious Sea Star. So in this little clip, you can see 2 sea stars in the background. It's kind of in the surf zone, so there's lots of sand floating around in the water. These are the ochre star. And in this next clip, we can actually see another species called the leather star. So this sea star kind of down at the bottom, I'm going to pause the video just for a second. This is a leather star. Both the species we just showed you are predators that cruise around slowly in the intertidal and eat lots of other organisms, even mussels. They can pry apart mussels, slowly pry the mussel apart. And they actually eat the mussel rather than prying the mussel all the way apart. They eat the mussel by extruding their own stomach from inside their body, outside their body into the mussel shells, and then they digest the mussel inside its own shell. It's pretty fearsome. One of the neat things you can see on this clip of this sea star is the little pale dot there, and that's actually not an injury. That's a part of the sea star called the madreporite. So the madreporite is where the sea star actually draws seawater into its body, and then it uses that water to control all of its little feet on the underside. So that's our leather star. Another name for the leather star is actually the garlic star. And some people claim that when they hold the garlic star out of the water, they can actually get a little whiff of garlic from it, which is actually a chemical compound that sea star is releasing to deter other predators from trying to eat it. Okay, back to Kelly.
All right. Well, we didn't get very far in our exploration. We ended up back at the same tide pool that we started because there happens to be an ochre star in this tide pool today. Maybe you noticed it earlier. It's down near the bottom, and I'll do my best to try and pick it up, but honestly, I doubt I'll be able to because they're so good at sticking. Oh, never mind. I'm a liar. Oh, and this ochre star happens to have something unusual going on. There's actually an extra leg on this ochre star. There's normally only 5 arms. It's a little contorted because of how it was attached to the rock earlier, but there are actually 6 arms on this particular ochre star. So that's unusual. Probably what happened at some point, this ochre star got damaged, and in the process of losing a leg, it accidentally grew back 2 legs in place of where there would have only been 1 originally. That happens sometimes. If I flip this ochre star over, underneath it has hundreds of tiny little suction cups, which is why I'm surprised that I was able to pick it up as easily as I did, because those suction cups are really, really, really strong. They grip onto the rocks, or in this case, it was gripped onto a mussel, and it was trying to eat the mussel, no doubt. But since this is kind of a smallish ochre star, I imagine that it wasn't going to get too far at eating some of the big California mussels that are in this tide pool. But it was probably going to try because they're hungry little creatures. So I'm going to put it back the way that I found it. And that is great practice for you too. If you ever get the chance to visit a beach like Brady's or any beach really, when you find an animal, it's always great to pick it up, have a look at it. You know, even if you're taking it out of the water for a few minutes, that's okay. But make sure that you put it back the way that you find it. So I'm going to just leave it where it came from and let nature take its course here. Whatever was going on, we'll just let that keep happening, and it can stay in this tide pool where it was found. Pretty cool. So that's a small ochre star. They do get to be maybe about this size altogether when they're full grown. And there are some other sea stars on the coast that get even bigger than that. So, small little ochre star. Those also come in orange sometimes, not always purple. Further down the beach, there's a special tide pool that has a relative of the ochre stars and the other sea stars in the tide pool that are a lot more spiky, and they also happen to be purple. So I'll give things back over to Owen to show you this other relative that's sometimes found in tide pools.
Okay, one more video for you here. As we get underwater, you will notice a couple of sea urchins. So it's actually not that common to find sea urchins in tide pools, but occasionally you do come across them in certain environments. This is the purple urchin. And you might notice that this tide pool is lacking in seaweed. So we're going to pan across. There's another one right on the edge there. And so one of the possible reasons why that tide pool in particular is missing seaweed is because those urchins eat it all. So one of the favorite foods of urchins is seaweed, in particular kelp. They really, really like to eat kelp. And so they probably grazed that whole tide pool bare. In fact, sea urchins are such voracious kelp grazers that they can actually totally decimate kelp forests. And in some ecosystems, they have totally eaten all of the kelp when the predators of the sea urchins are removed. So those predators could be things like sea otters or giant sunflower sea stars, both of which have had their populations decline significantly for the sea otters because they were hunted by humans, and for the sunflower stars because they were impacted by a disease called sea star wasting disease, which is unfortunately damaged a lot of the sea star population. So when those predators are removed, the sea urchin populations can grow out of control, and they end up eating a lot of the seaweed, and sometimes even decimating kelp forests and leaving behind what are called urchin barrens. So kind of neat to see some sea urchins in the intertidal zone, but we don't really see them that often in tide pools. Back over to Kelly.
Okay, we're almost to the end of our lesson, and I'm really happy to be able to show you one last live creature that I just found in a new tide pool at my feet here. Before we finish off for the day, I want to share with you, I'll get right in here. What have we got? Let me see if I can turn him around for the camera. We have a tiny little hermit crab here. And this hermit crab has taken a whelk shell for its home, but it was found crawling in this tide pool at my feet, hidden under a bunch of surf grass, that green seaweed that we showed you swirling around in the waves. Oh, and look, it's brave enough to do some walking around in my hands. Luckily, hermit crabs are not dangerous, or at least our hermit crabs here in BC. They're not dangerous. I don't have to worry about this one pinching me or anything. I'm being very careful with it because I really don't want to drop it, because from this height, if it falls out of my hands and goes back down to the rocks, I could hurt it a little bit. So I'm trying to be really careful, although it's getting more and more brave crawling through my hand. Is there a question? I didn't spot it necessarily so much as I went looking for it because I really wanted to be able to show you a hermit crab today. They're just so much fun to share, especially when they're brave enough to do some wandering. So I went looking and I peeled aside all the bits of surf grass and seaweed that were in this pool here, and it just happened to be hiding under there. So I was just lucky, really. I didn't actually see it. And just like with that sea star, I'm going to put it back the way that I found it, back in its whelk shell. Hermit crabs are kind of fun creatures because they they're always having to find new shells. So as they grow larger, they have to keep finding bigger and bigger shells that will fit on their back. So they're moving homes all the time. That's a pretty typical thing for a hermit crab. So that particular one right now is living inside a whelk shell, but as it continues to grow, it will find a different, bigger shell each time. I think Owen also has some footage of some hermit crabs, which were also taken in pools here on Brady's Beach. We can have a look at that. Now is a great chance for any last minute questions too from the audience. So type them in and we'll answer them before we sign off for the day.
I certainly do. This is one of my favorite video clips because hermit crabs are my favorite animal. So as we get underwater here in this tide pool, you see what look like snails, but actually if you're patient enough, you might see little hermit crabs are actually living inside those snail shells instead. So there's a common intertidal hermit crab crawling up on that rock there. You can see its little antennae flicking around in the water. It's actually smelling the water with those antennae, just like you would use your nose to smell your environment. And here we got a little video clip of two hermit crabs who have found a worm. Maybe it was already dead. Maybe they actually caught it themselves. And they're slowly pulling that worm apart with their claws and eating it. So playing a little bit of a tug of war here with that worm. Seeing who can eat it first. And then we just startled the hermit crab there in the video clip by accident. So you actually saw it retract into its shell. So those shells are really great ways to defend themselves from predators. Is to find a shell that you can live in and retract into if a predator comes along looking for you.
Oh, and you mentioned that the hermit crabs were using their antennae to kind of smell and sense their surroundings. That's one way that this visit falls short by doing it as a virtual visit to Brady's Beach. You guys don't get to smell the smell of the seashore at low tide. It's salty and it's seaweedy, and unfortunately you're gonna have to just plan a trip to the coast one of these days if you don't already live nearby to come and experience this for yourself. But in the meantime, it's been so much fun being able to show you all of these creatures in the different tide pools within the intertidal zone at beautiful Brady's Beach, and I really thank every one of you for joining and watching. So thank you also to Jen behind the camera. Awesome job. And of course, Owen and I have had such a blast sharing these lessons with you today. So thank you everyone for watching, and we're going to say goodbye.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Check out our YouTube channel for lots of other virtual field trip content, and enjoy the rest of Ocean Week Canada. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.